Welcome back to the Unbound Unplugged podcast. This is episode 25, and Michael and I are here to talk about RPE, RIR, and an explanation for each and how to apply it to your training. RPE and RIR are an interesting concept because it changes the way that we think about lifting. A lot of the time when we lift, we think about percentages, and people love percentages. They love a set amount. They love something that they can look for, aim towards. It's like, hey, you'll do 5x5 back squats at 75%. Oh, what's 75%? Let me just chuck it in my calculator and do it. It's easy. It's something that you can remember. Why would you do RPE? Why would you do RIR if that's the case? It's so much easier to do percentages. The reason why we like RPE is because it changes the stimulus of the session. Let's say I come in after a great night's sleep. I had awesome food and I'm feeling amazing. 75% for 5x5, easy done. I could do that any day of the week. Let's say the opposite though, which is probably more common if we use our rule of thirds. 66% of the time you're not going to have a great day or you're going to have an average day. I come in 75% seems like absolutely world ending. So an RPE approach can change that little bit of a mindset and that perception. So instead of aiming for 75%, I'm looking to leave 2 reps left in the tank or go for an 8 RPE. I might actually get more weight in that sense because I'm basing it off feel, not a set percentage. Michael, you've got a little bit more explanation of what RPE and RIR are, but let's just first start off by defining what RPE means.
So RPE is rate of perceived exertion, and then RIR is reps in reserve, and they work on opposites. So you've probably seen it trending a little bit on social media. It's starting to get out there a bit more. One of the great things about it is it allows for auto-regulation like you just spoke about. Unfortunately, people just like black and white. They want things to be extremely simple. Reality is nothing is simple. There's too many variables. This allows for you to control based on those variables. It is probably a more consistent way for people to train, and it allows them to not necessarily come in and feel like they're failing. So if you just spoke about doing 75%, you've had a bad day, you haven't slept, things have come up, right? You come in and you know you need to do sets of 8, you can't do them. Now in your mind you failed. You didn't do the session as it was prescribed. Reality is you still got a lot out of that session. Just based on that day, you could have worked lighter for the same stimulus. Another way to kind of think about it is you'll hear the term volume. All right, so let's just define volume while we're here as well. So volume is your weight times your reps times your sets. All right. So when we look at RPE and RIR, we're using it in our program at the moment. RPE is basically your perceived effort. So let's say I'm working an RPE 8. We normally go from 1 to 10 or 0 to 10. All right. So 8 just means that it's an 8 out of 10 difficulty. In terms of RIR, that means that it's 2 reps in reserve. So I've got 2 reps left in the tank before I fail. All right. So they work on the opposite end of the spectrum, but they basically mean the same thing. Now, something we also need to consider here is if we are working rate of perceived exertion, all right, we need to understand that most people under-perceive exertion. Or they overestimate difficulty. This set was disgusting. I couldn't do any more reps. If we actually tested them, they're generally going to have another 4 to 5 reps in the tank. So you need to also be aware of that, and it does mean at some point we are going to need to test that. All right, what's your opinion on that?
RPE and RIR are interesting because, like you said, people have a perceived amount of pain that they're willing to take, and then they're going to be like, yeah, that's enough. Whereas they're not willing to push. There's only that 1% who are willing to push past that, do the David Goggins and go all the way. So my opinion, compound lifts can be quite tricky to figure it out. It's going to be more auto-regulation. It's going to be based on how you feel. But more of our dumbbell, kettlebell, machine work, and isolation lifts can actually be pushed to failure as a priming set. So let's say we'll take 3 sets, for example, of 10 reps on the dumbbell bench as my little bit of an example exercise. And I'm like, I don't really know how much I can dumbbell bench. First set, your goal is to find a weight that allows for failure at around about 10. And in your head, or even out loud, it makes it a bit easier to voice it. Let yourself know when you think you're at 8 RPE. So I've done the bench, I've done 7, I've done 8 RPE. And then keep going. See how many more reps you can get. You might go 11, 12, 13, or you might be spot on 10. Let's say you did more reps. Let's say I got 13 reps. Okay, 8 RPE at that weight is going to be 11, a 2 RIR is going to be 11. So there's 2 reps left in reserve if I go to 11 out of the 13 reps. that's just an easy way to find out. Obviously, machines are going to be way easier for that because you can push yourself to failure far easier. But things like dumbbells, kettlebells, they're going to be also...
It's easier to recover from too.
Yeah, and you're not going to be like bending your body and trying to be like, oh crap, I'm going to failure on a deadlift set and it's just going to break you for the remaining training session. So as far as, you know, squats, deadlifts, bench, things like that, they can be a little bit trickier to figure it out, but just base it on your previous experience, or if you have a coach there, ask for their advice based on what they know about your training.
And there's a couple of strategies you can use. If you know that you're someone who's like that, the superset is great. So if you look at some of the data that's come out, supersetting back squats with light barbell banded hip thrusts is a great way for you now to just create extra stimulus without overloading the nervous system or dropping too much intensity on those compound lifts, but still giving you some of that benefit. It is hard to go to failure all the time. Like you said, very few people are going to be able to tolerate that and tolerate that consistently. So there are strategies that we can utilize or work around. The other one is adding your isometrics on your final reps. So if you do have the RPE 8 that you're working towards, you get to your rep range that you think you need to work at. Let's say we're doing leg extensions. You just do a hold, all right? Add extension on the last rep and just hold it for as long as you can. Then when you fail, drop it back down. It's not going to beat you up, but it allows you to work closer to threshold.
Yeah, and especially if you are like, oh, I've done 8 reps, you know, that was the goal, and I probably have another 2 or 3 in me, and you just like, okay, well, if I hold this, then it's going to create the same stimulus that would be if I was truly at my weight. And then the next set, you might add like 2.5 kilos onto that one, just to be sure that you're going in that right direction. On top of that as well, like one of the things that I'm really excited about with this kind of training is I think people will actually push themselves harder with bodybuilding accessories than they would in a CrossFit workout. It's so much easier to go to failure on a preacher curl than it is to go to failure on an assault bike sprint. Like it's just 2 different pain levels. You've got less muscles you're working, you're isolating a muscle group rather than working your entire body, and your heart rate remains pretty low. It's when the heart rate gets elevated, people panic, and then that's when they're like, oh, I better back off, I better pull out. I'm not gonna go to that blackout state. Whereas with this type of training, like yeah, you won't feel like you're gonna black out, but at least you'll push yourself harder than you probably ever have before.
Yeah, and something you also need to take away from this, like one of the biggest confidence boosters for me anyway is it allows variety. Like you're not restricted to the fact that you have to do a specific rep range or you have to do a specific movement. It allows variability, which is great. It means things don't get boring. You can come in and you can do a superset one day. Then you can come in and you can do an isometric hold the other day. You can add 3 movements if you want to add 3 movements. It's not this boring cookie cutter, I have to do back squats, I have to go to failure on every repetition, I have to feel like my hips are beat up or my knees are beat up.
It's just, yeah, it's a more flexible way to train. And I actually, one of the strategies that I've used from a programming perspective to force people to go to failure is what they call an intensity set. So it's kind of a new concept for a lot of you guys who are more CrossFit based. It's not something that we add in a lot, but from my powerlifting background, it's an immense tool that you can use to squeeze out a couple more reps towards the end of the set. It also combines that with top sets, which I'll explain in just a moment. But an intensity set, let's use the close grip bench because it's my favorite example for it. Let's say we're doing 3 sets of 10 at 60%. Now, I know we're talking about RPE, RIR. We've got a percentage based here, but as we know with percentages, they can be either too heavy or too light for some people. So trying to squeeze out a few more reps can be a good way to do it. With the intensity set, you perform your first 2 sets of 10 at the weight prescribed, 60%. The weight doesn't change. The final set, however, does. You go for an intensity set. So you'll go for max reps, as many as you can possibly manage at that last set, still at the same weight. You might get 10, you might get less, you might get more. It's a good way to tell if you've actually pushed yourself hard enough, and you don't have a choice. It's programmed in there. So it's like, and for me, when I do that type of training, my goal is to beat the amount. So if it's 10, I want to go for 11. And then next week when I do the component again, the percentage goes up, but the reps stay the same. So now you're like, oh, I've done it. It's an extra 5%. And I'm still going to failure. So it's pretty good. It's one of those things where it can really have some benefits in that training. Top sets are also one of those things as well. With top sets, the idea of a top set is it starts heavy. So when you're freshest at the start of your session, you might do a top set of 7, top set of 8, and that's a heavy set. Let's use the push press as an example. So you're fresh, you go for, it's pretty much like a 1 set of 8 at an 8 RM. You go for the best set possible. Then from there, you do some back off sets, 2 sets of 8 to 10 at an 8 or 7 RPE. So you've got an idea of what your top end strength is. You've added 2 to 4 reps. So you're like, okay, so you have a bit more better idea of, okay, if that is a 10 RPE at an 8 reps, maybe going 10 reps, I'll take off 10 kilos. That will suit me well. And then you'll do a max effort set at 50% of the weight that you finished on from the 2 sets of 8 to 10. So just different little strategies that I've employed in the program to force you to produce more intensity, to put in more work, and to get a better idea of the RPE and RIR.
Yeah, and I suppose this is a great way to pivot into where does this all come from. So we look at we're going to touch on 3 studies that have come out this year, and we'll talk about it to give you guys a bit more context about why these things are important, where they're important, and understanding that there is flexibility in training, and that is a good thing. We'll start with study 1, and study 1, we'll link all the studies in the bio and in the comments below for you guys or anyone that wants to read them. Is training to failure. So looking at training to failure, this is mainly built around hypertrophy. All right, so it's exploring the dose response and relationship to hypertrophy responses based on rep ranges. Now, the main thing that they found with hypertrophy or building muscle in particular is as long as you're working to failure, the reps don't actually matter. As long as you're within about 0 to 2 reps of failure, that seems to be the more optimal range. That doesn't mean you can't still get muscle gain if you're 3 to 5 reps. It's just more optimal the closer you are to failure. The rep range, whether you're working, let's say our normal strength rep ranges, so we're doing somewhere between 1 to 4 repetitions or 1 to 6, depending how you want to define it, or we're doing our common hypertrophy, which is normally 8 to 14, or you've got your endurance. It's pretty much the same across all, as long as everyone is training towards failure, which means another strategy that we could utilize is building sets, like you said, or drop sets or other variations. So you can start light and you can start with higher rep ranges, and then you can go into a heavier weight with lower rep ranges, and then you can finish with some strength sets at the back end, and you're still going to get hypertrophy benefits across it. Now, something we do need to clarify though is your strength adaptation and your endurance adaptation are specific to those doses. So if you are targeting hypertrophy and you're only working, let's say I'm only working around about that 8 to 14 rep range, I am not going to get the strength adaptations that I would get from working those lower rep ranges. That doesn't transfer across all rep ranges. The endurance side of it as well. If I'm not working those higher rep ranges, I'm not going to get that endurance response that I would get from working those higher rep ranges.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing to also keep in mind is obviously everyone's different. So every person is going to adapt to a different rep range and a different stimulus. So maybe I'm from a endurance background, sets of 15 to 30 might just feel better for me because I'm just used to that kind of training. Vice versa, powerlifting background, 1 to 3 reps might feel ideal because at the end of the day, training adherence is probably going to be the number one thing. So you could do all the weird rep ranges you want, but if you're not showing up consistently and doing it, it's not going to make a difference. So I would always keep in mind, just because Michael said that I can do 30 reps, now I'm going to just do 30 reps for everything because I'm going to build muscle. It's like, well, playing around with some rep ranges will keep you more committed to training because you keep the variance high. And I like to pull it back to CrossFit because it's like I made a video recently about why CrossFitters have such big arms, but they don't really do arm hypertrophy specific training. It's because they train obviously compound lifts and they do a bunch of different rep ranges, but the one thing that's always the same is intensity. CrossFitters are incredibly intense, and it's literally in the CrossFit methodology.
They take things to failure.
Yeah.
Like you have AMRAP sets where you're doing max effort chest to bar or max effort muscle ups, and that's just the common theme is they're just working close to failure, so they're getting that adaptation.
Yeah, it's just normal. It's normal for CrossFitters to go hard. Yeah, obviously there's a big stigma, they go too hard, they get injured, blah, blah, blah. But compared to some other sports like running, CrossFit has a lower injury rate, and maybe it's because they have more hypertrophy, more muscle than those type of sports, and less impact in a lot of cases. Obviously that's not excluding, there's always outliers and things like that. But I actually think it is actually a really good point, those rep ranges, because it does allow you to be more flexible with your training. If you feel like, if you want to put on muscle and that's the goal, and you feel like that the strength cycle at the moment is just not your thing, you can always pivot your rep ranges higher and vice versa. If you're sick of doing 15 to 30 reps and you're like, I want to lift some heavy weight, you're still going to get that adaptation.
You get to go heavy. And if you're a power lifter and you're sick of doing these 1 to 3, your back's sore, your joints are just struggling at the moment, maybe there's other stuff going on in your life, you can drop back to lighter loads and higher rep ranges.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily just need to remove your deadlifting for 3 months.
I've actually seen, there was a video, it was about 70s powerlifters and their cycles, and the one thing that made them so large, if you look at them, yeah, obviously a buttload of trend, but there's no difference to the current powerlifters. Everyone's on it. You just got to be, you've obviously got to be realistic when you're looking at those type of people lifting those type of weights. And I'm not accusing anyone of anything, but what my point is that 70s powerlifters were massive. Like, they were just jacked, and that's because the way they're trained was more like a bodybuilder rather than a conventional powerlifter. So instead of the 1s, 2s, and 3s, they were doing 4 sets of 6 on bench press. Like, they were getting huge, and they were just doing all the accessory work that they needed, but their goal was to lift the most weight possible. Yes, powerlifters these days are better at lifting, but are they? Are they just more efficient? They're lifting with wider grips, bigger arches, better positions, and they have more understanding and more technology? Possibly.
They're also, you need to consider that, like, people these days are also less enduring.
Yeah.
So that's just reality. Like, our ancestors just had to go through more stuff. Everything, life was harder, things were harder. They didn't have the nice cushy barbells that Rogue Goen designed. They didn't have these cool Atlas stones. It was rugged, it was rough. They could just tolerate more.
Yeah, and you look at Louis Simmons, Westside Barbell versus the World. They was a bunch of big dudes on roids training in a garage, and they would beat each other up if someone talked shit, or like, it was just a different training environment. But they produced some of the best athletes with some of the best results in the world, and it's purely because of their training. They weren't just focused on the 1s, 2s, and 3s. They were focused on other things, taking things to failure, and that's literally their trademark, is taking disadvantaged lifts to failure and progressing those lifts week to week, slowly getting more specific towards the power list as the meat comes up.
A little bit off topic, but I think, like, one thing that you can kind of take away from that is that state of play, or that mindset of play, just never went away for them. So they were always fiddling and trying different things and seeing how their body responded. People don't do that now. People just buy into a cult. Oh, I'm a 10 rep range person. Oh, I'm this, I'm that. No one's exploring and trying to use the feedback that they're getting and going, oh, well, that didn't work for me, I'll try the next thing. Oh, well, that didn't work, I'll try the next thing. And I think that's something we need to understand, is like, we have plenty of options out there, and we should be willing to stay in that state of play and try things, find what works for us.
Yeah, what does that mean for someone at home? It just means that, okay, like, I've done a lot of CrossFit. I haven't really touched on bodybuilding accessories. Maybe this will be the thing that actually increases my performance, because now I've got a lot more endurance in my muscles. I have a lot more muscle mass. I'm able to hold bigger sets on things like thrusters, high rep, muscle up sets, because you've been doing more dipping training. You've been practicing more of the principles. So it's interesting. You said there was 3 studies. That's one.
Yeah, study two is actually kind of cool. So study 2 is, can stretching improve muscle gain? Ooh. So again, this is all kind of around hypertrophy. And yes, the short answer is yes, stretching can, but it has to be in end ranges. All right. So an example of how this might look with in terms of like optimizing proper programming, it's quarter reps. So if you see this come in where muscles at full stretch and fully lengthened, you do see hypertrophy adaptations. Now, the research is relatively new, so we'll have to kind of see when they dig into it a little bit more what else kind of happens. But that's pretty cool, because that means that we don't necessarily need to avoid stretching because we're worried about losing muscle gain or anything like that. We do know that range of motion is one of the most important things for hypertrophy. So a quarter squat, a half squat versus a full squat is always going to create more hypertrophy because you're taking the muscle through full range of motion. Now, the quarter squat is almost like, the 1 1/4 squat is almost like a combination of the two and the best of both worlds. So you're going all the way down into end range, you're coming up a quarter, back down into end range, and then driving back through. it's another way that you can almost utilize both of those things. And it's another strategy that we spoke about using for just taking things a little bit closer to failure without having to put on too much weight or without having to make things to the point where they beat you up.
Yeah, and it's not just exclusive to the squat. The deadlift is also a movement you can do 1 1/4 to. The bench press, like they've all got that option for that variation. One of the counterpoints though to stretching, and I want to discuss with you, is not so much the hypertrophy side of it, but the strength side of it. There's also been data that's proven that stretching prior to workouts, as an example, because you've lengthened the muscle, it decreases strength output. What's your thoughts about on that, Michael?
Yeah, so there's a lot of studies that need to be done from that, and we need to try and work out what the mechanism specifically is. So for example, is it just the fact that the muscle is stressed so we have a delayed CNS response? So an example is just your body telling that muscle to contract or those fibers to contract. Are we just getting delayed signaling because it's stressed from the stretching that you've done prior? That'll come out in the next few years. Someone will do that study and we'll get a little bit more information. It generally tends to be dose dependent. So I know exactly what study you're talking about, and it was fairly decent amounts of time under tension. So when they were stretching, it wasn't just, hey, I'm doing a forward fold for 10 seconds or 20 seconds. It was, hey, I'm doing a forward fold for 2 to 4 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of stress stimulus. I don't know anyone who's done ROMWOD and you've got some of these 10-minute poses. Hey, you're doing a straddle and you're holding for 10 minutes. I get DOMs. So I'm sore for the next 24 hours. There's no way I'd be able to go and deadlift from that.
Yeah, of course. And it's obvious, it's crazy to think that people actually do stretch heavily. But that's the thing that used to be taught in football training. You used to stretch before you started. And I get it. It's mobilizing things. But that's why they've changed they're pivoted when the data's come out to more dynamic warm-ups.
Dynamic movement, blood flow orientated, yeah.
Yeah, rather than static. But when I was doing footy, it was always stretches. You were literally stretching everything and then you would start. And I got so many injuries from it. And I just never knew why. I just I didn't stretch enough. But that actually wasn't the case. It was the stretching was probably causing the injuries because I wasn't warm when I started. I just did a few quad stretches, did some piriformis stretches, and I was yeah, all right, sweet, ready to go. So
a great workaround for that. It doesn't necessarily mean don't stretch. It just means kind of change the way you do it. So add some end range contractions. When you're in that little bit of a forward fold, drive your heel into the ground for 2, 1, relax. Drive your heel into the ground for 2, 1, relax. Yeah. Just add some variation into it and don't be excessive with it.
But obviously, like we mentioned, it's those extreme stretching lengths that's going to cause the strength decrease. So if you're doing a little bit of stretching, 20 seconds, that's fine. That's not going to have any effect. It's going to put you in a better position. And then, like Michael said, you're going to get deeper, which will recruit more muscles. With your stretching study that you saw, Michael, where what does it say where to stretch? Is it during the lift? Is it after the work that you've completed? Where is the position that you're looking for stretching? Is it just at home by yourself? If you stretch more, I'll gain more muscle. What if the listener's okay, where do I stretch? Where do I get this stretch from to gain more muscle? Where is it?
It seems to be dose dependent. So there still needs to be a lot more study. It's very fresh. It's just kind of exciting because it's throwing a spanner in the works in our industry because everyone's stretching and strength training. They're on opposite ends of the spectrum. They don't necessarily have the same benefit as where this study is throwing, like we said, that spanner in the works. It seems to be intensity focused. So if the stretch is relatively intense, you are still getting an adaptation, and part of that adaptation is an increase in muscle mass.
Yeah.
Whether it's obviously going to be more common in people that are undertrained or new to training. But like I said, it's just an interesting area to keep an eye on to just see what comes from it. The third study that we're going to touch on here is probably the one that most people want to know about. And it's kind of what matters more. So it dives into, is it the load that matters more or is it the reps that matter more? Before we dive into the study, what's your perspective on that?
Surely the correct answer is it depends on a lot of variables. Load, reps, I guess if we're applying principle from what you were mentioning initially, intensity is more what the driving factor should be. So reps or sets. Was the sets?
So it's all progressive overload.
What's the weight? Sorry.
Yeah. So the study is really just trying to define so is it better to progress weight or is it better to progress reps? So when we progress weight up, we decrease reps. Yeah. When we don't, so let's say I had a 100 kilo back squat, that I'm doing. Week 1, I do 8 reps. Week 2, I do 9 reps. Then I do 10. That's progressive overload on the rep side of it.
Yeah, that's volumizing.
Yeah. Versus progressive overload, if I'm just doing a set of 6 on the back squats at 100, then next week I do 103 and I do 6 reps. The next week I do 105 and I do 6 reps. That's the load. Progressive overload.
Yeah, linear progression. But then you can do kind of both. There's step progressions where your volume and your reps increase. And your weight increases. So like, let's say, you do 3x3 at 100 kilos, for example. Then the next week you do 3x3 at 105 kilos. The following week you might do 3x4 at 105 kilos. And then that's still progression. So that's a bit of a mixture of both. I guess, like I said, like intensity being the driving factor, like, it's going to be very interesting to see what the answer is, but my answer would be whatever works for you.
Which is pretty much what the study said. You get benefits from both.
Yeah,
so
of course.
It really just is the fact that it's intensity. So you can either progress the intensity by increasing the reps, or you can progress the intensity by increasing the weight. And then, like you said, that comes all the way back circle to the RPE that we're talking about, where it's like, okay, RPE allows for auto-regulation. Again, this just gives us the ability to auto-regulate a bit more, which is great. We don't have to come in and train and feel like we just failed, right? We just had a day where we just weren't feeling as well, but we still got a lot of benefit from that.
Yeah, and actually one of my clients had this interesting thing that they said to me. She's like, she did the 3 sets of 8 was an example that I prescribed, but instead of going up in weight each set, she's like, I finished the 3 sets at 8. It was hard, but I had a lot more energy that day, so I did an extra set.
Yeah.
You never hear that, like, oh, well, great, excellent. So she had more in the tank, but, let's say it wasn't that kind of thing. Maybe she did 2 sets of 8 instead the next week. She's like, oh, I wasn't feeling it, like, had a rough day. But then it's just going to be based on how she feels. She's not, the thing is when you have a set range, so let's say I'm just asking Michael, you need to do 3 sets of 10, but you're actually fried. Like, you're fried from whatever the rest of the week was. Yeah, you might drop the load, but then it still might be too much. Like, even at like half the weight, you might be like, 3 sets seems like a lot today. Then it's just that auto-regulation. Be like, as long as I'm getting something in, it's always going to be better than nothing. So you've done 2 sets of 8 reps rather than 3 sets of 10. That's going to be better than being like, nah, I'm going to have a rest day today. Get nothing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, you look at classic CrossFit programming or programming these days, it's 5 to 7 sets on half the things. Yeah. So you come in and it's Friday. It's been a big week. It's been hectic training. All right, you see 7 sets. Most people, if they get fixated on doing the 7 sets, I can guarantee you the first 3 to 4 sets are almost wasted. Yeah. Like, they just start lighter. They just build. They use them as almost like warm-up sets. And then there's only 2 or 3 sets with intensity. You could just do the 2 or 3 sets with intensity and not worry about doing all 7 or all 5.
Yeah, they call it junk volume. It's when you do a set or a couple of reps that you just get nothing out of because you've just got no energy or no effort left. And that's when you know that, like we were talking about right at the beginning, you have a set amount of set ranges or sets per muscle group. And if you've done too many, like, yeah, obviously your more experienced guys are going to have more in the tank. But if you've done too many, then eventually it's just going to get to the point where you're actually either doing no gains or regressing because you're putting your body in a further deficit of recovery. So sometimes it actually can be better to do less in certain scenarios, and it's just going to be your ability to auto-regulate yourself. It's hard. I know it's hard. Sometimes you just want to, those people who just want to achieve everything, they're like, bloody hell, this workout's got, blah, 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 these sets, these reps. I don't feel it today, but I'm going to grind through it. I'm going to get it done. That might not be the best idea. And then vice versa. There's people who are very easy to pull out of training and be like, oh, crap, I don't feel good. No harm in having a rest day. It might be better for you to come in, do some light sets of squats, some lighter deadlifts, work on technique and positioning, still get the stimulus in and still get those adaptations.
Exactly. There's probably both ends of the spectrum here where you get someone who's always changing the programming and then you get someone who's never changing the programming who probably should. The person comes in and have to do it as prescribed, have to do everything they tell me to do. They don't auto-regulate anything. And they're generally the person who gets beat up or run down or ends up dropping off at some point.
Yeah. Well, I think that's covered off everything nicely about our episode 25, RP and reps in reserve, and an explanation of each. If you guys have any questions about this particular question or podcast itself, any questions you want us to answer on the next podcast, please leave it in the comments down below, either on YouTube, Spotify, or on our Instagram, Unbound Athletic.
If you have some time, definitely have a read of some of the studies. It's pretty interesting.
Cool. And that's going to cover us off. We'll see you guys next week. on the next podcast.